Hi everyone and welcome to the Curious Geographer Live. I'm so excited and about today's session. We are going to be talking to Chloe Searle about NEA common mistakes, and I know a lot of you are about to start your NEA, kind of in the process of your NEA, or might be doing it in the future. So hopefully there's going to be loads of tips. I've actually had a sneak peek at them, so there will be loads of fantastic ones that you can take away and take home to put forward into your NEA. If you're new to my channel, don't forget to subscribe and also check out the live interviews. We've got a few more coming up as well. If I just introduce our guest before we start. So Chloe is an independent field studies tutor who's written award-winning resources for both the Royal Geographical Society and the Geographical Association. Her books are fantastic. She's an author, an educational consultant. She's authored the most amazing fieldwork textbooks that we have copies of at school, and they're fantastic for teachers, but also for students as well. So if you want to look at them, I think Chloe will tell you where to look at. But there's resources on the Geographical Association, and also she has an amazing website which she'll talk about. Chloe studied at the University of Birmingham and the University of Essex, and she was a teacher for 20 years. So we're super lucky because she's got loads of experience. Just a quick fact, Chloe said first knew she wanted to study geography when at age 9 she saw Michael Palin's amazing documentary Around the World in 80 Days. So if I pass over to Chloe, and if you want to say hi, and then we're going to kind of go straight into your top tips.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for that really generous introduction. And I think you've probably given my age away as well by students who can work out when Michael Palin was on TV. I need to first of all start by saying, well, first of all, welcome to this, and I'm really happy to see that there's people on the call. But also just to say, I do work for an exam board, but nothing I say today is coming from an exam board. It's not affiliated by any particular exam board. What I'm about to say just comes from years of experience of teaching A-level and the NEA and supporting hundreds of students through the process. So it's coming from a place from experience rather than directly the words from the awarding bodies. So to start off, our first tip, and I've kind of grouped these hopefully in the order in which you would traditional way that you would write up an NEA. So this is in the kind of getting organised phase, and that's all about a mistake that a lot of students make is they don't keep any kind of research diary, is how I'm kind of phrasing it. So a research diary, it can be literally anything, just a notebook where you're writing down what you're doing at each stage. Who are you reading? What kind of key information did you get from that book or that journal? How did you feel when you found this particular piece of information out? Maybe it might be during your data collection phase. You might want to make a note of perhaps a little mishap that happened during the data collection phase, or something unexpected that happened that you might want to reference later on. The NEA is a long process in most schools. It can take, a long time from the moment it's introduced to you to the moment you hand in that final document. And to keep your brain ticking over all of the different elements of it can be quite a big deal. And even for the top researchers, they're not able to remember everything they did at the start by the time they're in the write-up stage. So keeping a research diary is a great way of just reminding yourself of lots of different stages and of thought process that you went through. And with that in mind, it's really so useful when you come to those final bits of the write-up where you're talking about justification and evaluation. Because you can talk about, well, in the beginning, I felt like this about this particular topic, and my thinking evolved into this instead. And you can actually document that by keeping a really good research diary. My next tip to do with keeping organised is about using key geographical words. We use them all the time. But strangely, I've read quite a few NEAs where they just completely disappear off the page. So remember to use all those great words, all that great vocabulary that you've been learning right from year 7 all the way through to year 12 and 13, whenever you're writing this up. So as you're doing what I'm terming your desk research, you're doing your reading, as you're writing things up, keep a running glossary going of the kind of terms and phrases that you know you're going to be needing to use. Then when you go back through and you're checking your work, you realise, actually, I could have used the word sustainability here. I could have used a word better than just infrastructure or something like that here. So you can actually then really kind of make your writing more mature and more geographical, and therefore have more meaning. And it's just going to make whoever's marking your paper and whoever's moderating your study, it'll just make them sit up and listen and go, ah, this person knows what they're talking about. And that can only be a good thing, can't it? Moving on, titles. It is the probably the slowest part of your entire NEA process is actually getting that title nailed down and having the confidence in it. And what I see a lot of is students choosing a title that's really, really big. It's way too broad. There's huge problems with those kinds of titles. You might not have the time to be able to collect the data effectively. It might mean that because it's so big, when you actually come to your conclusion, it kind of starts to feel a bit wishy-washy and a little bit grey, and you can't really focus in on anything which is geographically meaningful. I read a lot of studies where the title is so big and they then explore it in their literature review, for example, and then it comes to their conclusion, and really all they're able to do is kind of repeat what was in their literature review because they haven't been able to really focus in on a particular place or circumstance. So try to keep it quite narrow in focus, and try to keep it something which is really manageable. I am a huge fan of micro scale studies. It might be literally that 10 meters of a coast, a piece of coastal management, but that 10 meters. It might be that particular shop. It might be that particular little area of a high street. Keeping it small keeps it manageable, but it doesn't mean the geography is any less meaningful. Okay. Next one about titles is trying to test the untestable. I read quite a few titles where I think that's a really interesting question, but I don't think you'll be able to actually find the answer or anything which can actually even start to point towards the answer. I like to term these kind of black hole studies, because once students kind of enter down that route, it can be really difficult to really find anything to kind of grasp onto. Typically, and this is pure personal opinion on this, the kind of studies that you might want to think really carefully about whether you can fulfill the needs of the title are things like place comparisons. You visit one place, you visit another place, and then you see how they're different and how they're similar. That's a really difficult thing to do because you have to think about what is your control level in both places. You can compare two places if pretty much everything is similar about those two places, except for the key geographical factors that you're interested in. And let's be honest, how many of us can say we really know that there's two places that are so similar that they actually are comparable? I'll give you an example. Something I kind of read quite often is where a student has gone on holiday to one place. Let's say they've gone to Newquay in Cornwall, and then they are comparing it with a London borough, and they're making observations about how different they are. Well, of course they're different. They're so totally different that actually there's no kind of similarity between the two places that you can hook the geography onto. So be really, really careful when it comes to place comparisons, and make sure that there's enough similarity between the places that any comparison you're making is actually testable. Something else which I'd probably say try to avoid is things about temporal change, how something has changed over time. You're probably going to be visiting your field site in a snapshot of a moment. If you're really lucky, you'll be there for 4 days or a week on a residential or something like that. I imagine most of you are probably going to be there for a much, much shorter period of time. How can you honestly say how something has changed over time if you're there only in one snapshot of an instance? You can do if you're super lucky with your secondary data, and you have great secondary data that you can use to compare with what you're seeing right now. Something that I do on the island, I'm very lucky that I can go out and collect data, and I might, after a big storm event on the island, I might go out and perhaps take some beach profile data. Students can then use that to show how the beach shape has changed pre during and post storm conditions, and then they can obviously compare that with what they've got then. But really, temporal change is quite a difficult thing. Something I see quite a lot. So I'm going to coast quite a lot. I live on an island, so I do quite a lot of work on coasts. But something I hear is how sea defences might have changed how people view a town, or how it's changed the shape of a beach or something like that. It's really difficult because it's not like you can scrape away those sea defences in the time that you're there and see what happens in the meantime. So as I was saying, like with the place comparisons, not impossible, but you have to be really, really careful and super confident that you can actually test those things. And the third one is ongoing events. Two very popular studies at the moment. One is the effect of COVID on place X, and the effect of the Ukraine conflict on place X. Very, very difficult to do because they are continuing. They are processes which are still happening. So the minute you start drawing a conclusion or starting to find out some information, the picture has changed. So it can be quite difficult to really draw into a real conclusion at the end, because you end up with a conclusion which is saying, well, in the time frame I had, this is what I felt, or this is what happened, but it's still a process that's ongoing. Now, particularly with something like COVID, yes, we might think of ourselves as coming into this kind of like normality now. Let's hope we are. But really, the long-term effects of COVID as a kind of an event across our lives are really unknown. It's not something which we can kind of close off. So it's quite difficult to really kind of draw in some geography on that. So if you are going to do something like those kinds of studies, be very specific about what it is about that current event which you are going to be looking at. The impact of COVID on place something is, going back to one of my earlier points, way too broad. Keep it really narrow. So you're moving into your introduction phase, where you've got your location study, you've got your literature review. So this kind of desk research, you haven't gone out in the field yet, you're kind of formulating it all together on your desk, and this is not given anywhere near enough time and energy. It is never a waste of your time to do that extra bit of reading. It informs you so much better, and particularly if you're going to a place for your field site which is unfamiliar to you. Again, those of you who are lucky enough to be going on a residential trip, or you're going to be using some of your holiday time to study a particular place, make sure that you know that place inside out before you go there. Otherwise, you're kind of wandering around a little bit in a daze when you're actually at the field site thinking, I don't really know where I am, and I don't really understand the background to the people here, and so on. So make sure that your literature review is really bulky. You might not include it all in the actual write-up. In fact, you're highly unlikely to. Top-level researchers at undergrad level will read probably a third more than they actually talk about within their study, because they needed to have that contextualization within their own minds so that they then know where they're going with their write-up. And again, as you might better see on the screen, textbook is great and a dictionary is great, but it's simply a starting point. There is so many resources out there available to students. The Roots Journal is a great one if you're familiar with that. If not, look it up. It's really good, and it covers an incredible breadth of topics, but at A-level kind of something that is digestible to A-level students. And of course, things like Geography Review and Wider World are still brilliant resources which most geography departments have. If not, talk to your school librarian, because they may be able to get it in for you, or be able to give you access to something similar through online subscriptions. Your librarian really can be your friend in this, and can really give you great advice about the kind of resources available to you beyond your textbook. So into the data collection phase. A common mistake is, and it's not really a mistake, it's just that it's not quite given enough thought, is that students don't often think about the type of data they actually need. there are so many different formats of data. You could have binary data, i.e. something like yes, no. You could have a score, so let's say from 1 to 5. And there's lots of different ways of scoring things, because you could go from negative score to a positive score. You could do something like a Likert scale. So that is where you've got, it's a type of scoring system, but it has value attached to it. So you have something like, how satisfied do you feel about blah, 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 blah. Dissatisfied, very dissatisfied, dissatisfied, neutral, satisfied, very satisfied, and so on. You could have category data. You could have ordinal data. There's lots and lots of different types of data to think about, more than I have the time now to go through. And I will be referencing something that's on my website that will really help you out if you're not sure about this. It's not as simple as just quantitative and qualitative data. There is a huge breadth within that as well. Now, why do you need to know about different types of data? Because the type of data that you require dictates how you're going to carry out your data collection, not the other way around. So quite often, as I've said here, avoid making your method technique-led. Students can quite often just, they pick a data collection technique and they say, I'm going to use this because it's to do with environmental quality, it's to do with noise, without actually thinking, what is it I actually want to hold at the end of this? What's the actual data need to be? How is it going to look on the page? And you really have to think even further ahead than that to, how am I going to analyze it? Because you might need to have data within categories if you're doing something like a chi-squared statistical test, or you might want to have it in rank to be able to be ranked in pairs. So something like Spearman's rank is the classic one as well. So think 3 stages ahead before you just say, oh, well, I want to know about noise, so I'm just going to go out with a decibel meter. Think it through in a bit more detail than that and think, how am I actually going to take this data from the page and do something else with it afterwards? Now, this kind of thing is the thing you can talk about with your teachers. You know, this is the kind of discussions that I would be using if you have one-to-one time with your teachers. This is the kind of stuff I would be talking about, so they can best kind of make suggestions to you about, well, have you thought about, you know, alternatives to what you were thinking of originally? Also in data collection, the pilot study is massively underused. A pilot study is where you go out into the field and you just give it a bit of a try. And if the data works, great, keep it. If it doesn't, change the method. This is so essential for 2 reasons. Number one, it means that when you actually are doing your data collection for real, you're not going to be wasting a whole lot of time. You can actually get it right from that point onwards. The second thing is, it is so valuable when you come to your evaluation section to be able to say, I actually did a pilot study. I found that this particular thing wasn't working, or it didn't work in that location, or the equipment wasn't suitable, and here's how I changed it, and I did it this way instead. You can pick up instantly, you know, high marks just by being able to be transparent about that kind of thing. The pilot study is not something which you hold in the background and don't talk about. You definitely want to be discussing it in your study. Absolutely essential if you are doing a questionnaire. We as geographers talk in geography language, and good for us, we should be doing that, but members of the public don't. It's a sad reality that there are many members of the public who have not studied geography. Okay, we should feel sorry for them. And with that in mind, you might talk about something like the environment, and you will know exactly what you're talking about. But a member of the public will interpret that word in a completely different way. And unless you've done a pilot study, your questionnaire could go in a completely strange direction, and actually you find at the end that you've got a limit to, you've got some of your answers are just not really usable. So think particularly around language, think particularly around how you are going to deliver your questionnaire if you're doing it face-to-face on the street. Something I've found that students really benefit from is if they're talking about a particular place. Let's say you are doing an investigation into regeneration, and you're talking about a particular site that has been regenerated. If you even use the name of that site, hopefully most of you members of the public would know where you're talking about, but they might not. So you might need to have a photo to show them, to say, this is the place I'm talking about. And they go, oh, yeah, we know it locally as blah, blah, blah instead. You wouldn't necessarily know that colloquial term for that place. So those kinds of things, just kind of give it a run, give it a good go on the pilot study. A good starting point is to try it on a member of your family or some friends who do not study geography, and just check that the language is at the level that everybody can understand. Right, what's our next one? Data presentation. This is the point your teachers will be tearing their hair out, because you produce some amazing data collection techniques. You've gone out in the field, you've created tons of data, you put it on the page, and then you forget to put the units on or something silly like that. Get the basics right with your data presentation. Create a checklist for the things that you need to include. I mean, I've included there, 6 key points, which are the classic ones that tend to get missed. On maps, quite often there isn't a scale bar, there isn't a north point. You might think, well, it's just background noise, isn't it? No, it isn't. Particularly scale, it can really make a difference. It might mean that your teacher can understand the area far better by being able to see what kind of area was covered by a transect or whatever. If it's a graph, something like the units, as I say, is it classic one is I see on the y-axis something like 0 to 100, and I think, well, is that raw data? Is that a percentage? Is that a score? I don't know what that number actually means, and so labeling the axis with that, very, very important as well. Make sure if you're using shading that you used a key, or if there's symbols on a map, that your key is representative of that, particularly if you've got proportional shapes. If you're using, for example, you've got a map and you've put situated pie charts or something like that on your map, great data presentation. You're going to get into those kind of top marks there for your data presentation. But unless I can see what those pie charts are actually meaning through a key, it all falls apart, doesn't it? And finally, make sure your data presentation has a title. Its title is not figure 7. Its title is a pie chart to show blah, 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 blah. A map showing the transects of blah, blah, blah. So start your title with what the basic data presentation is, a graph to show, and then tell me what it shows. Follow that pattern and then include your figure number as well, so it all kind of ties together, and you're onto a winner. Number 9. Right, we've moved on to data analysis and conclusions now. And this is an odd one, because I think this is something we kind of inherit as we're lower down the school, and it's something we inherit from science a little bit as well, is we talk really, I believe, too much about anomalies. So let's say we collect some data, we produce it into a scatter graph or something like that, and we see one bit of that scatter graph which is kind of away from the main trend. And we think, oh, it's an anomaly. And that's it. And we just ignore it. And we need to be a little bit cautious here, because you need to think, well, if all of my other data was collected accurately, why is that one not sitting in the trend? Now, to my mind, that one that's sitting outside the trend is probably the most interesting piece of data on that graph, because that piece of data represents something unusual happening geographically. And actually, that one piece of data might hold the key to something far more interesting than the general trend. So be very cautious about calling something anomalous just because it doesn't seem to fit with the pattern. Throughout your geography studies, you will have been introduced to models galore, Burgess, Butler model, and so on and so on. And a very common way of tackling the NEA is to say, let's see if this place can mirror a particular model, if the model holds true in this place. And it's a nice, safe, easy way to do an NEA, because you can say, yep, I went to this place and it's exactly like the model. Tick. And actually, when you then delve into the data a little bit more, you realize that geography is really messy. And actually, there's lots of opportunity to be discussing lots of geographical variables which take the model apart. And in my mind, not only is that more interesting, but that really stands you apart as a geographer, because you're willing to take something known and say, actually, this model in theory works, but in this particular location where I went, there were these other factors at play which caused something different to happen. So really be careful about labeling something an anomaly before you really think about it, and really take the time to analyze those outliers and look at it and think, well, where was that bit of data taken? Was there another reason for it? Now, it might be that there are some genuine issues with the data collection for that particular piece of data, which you can therefore say, I need to discount this. But don't go straight to that point. Think about it first. And number 10, it's in the evaluation section at the end. Something that students quite commonly do is they will evaluate their data collection phase only. So it's so easy to say, we went out into the field and we had to reduce our sample size because the rain was coming down and it was affecting our ability to do this, this, and this. And that's true. Yes, you should be talking about those types of things that limited your data or made it perhaps less reliable or valid. But actually, in your evaluation, what you're going to want to do is to evaluate the entire research process. Even, was this the right title to ask about this particular topic? Or actually, should I have asked this title instead? Those research questions or hypotheses, were they the best research questions I could have asked? Because your research questions will direct your entire study. Actually, maybe I should have had a fourth or fifth research question, which was looking at this particular angle. There is absolutely nothing wrong with getting to the end of your study and saying, I found all this out. It's brilliant, but my title was actually wrong at the end. And actually kind of throwing it all on its head and saying what I actually should have done was this, this, and this. So go through your titles, go through your most effective ways of doing something, or could you have done something different? Look at your stats tests you might have done in your analysis. Let's hope they were appropriate, but you might have chosen something that had collected more data at the start. You could have done a different statistical test in the data analysis stage, so you can discuss that as well. And something which is often overlooked is your role as a researcher within the process. By you being in a particular place, and this is particularly more perhaps towards physical geographers who are going to be perhaps actually having a direct impact on an environment, was your very presence in that place having an impact on the results? And that's quite an interesting thing to think about, because you almost want to sometimes think of yourself as this passive researcher, that there's them, the people or place that you are researching, and then there's you kind of sitting aside from it. But actually, you're not. You're in amongst people, and you will be influencing how people might see something. You'll be influencing the ground beneath your feet and how something might happen as a physical process. So also think about your evaluating yourself as a researcher within that space. Now, those are just 10, just 10 of my kind of top tips. There are lots more things that I could talk about, but if I had to choose 10, that's the 10 I wanted to come up with. But I'd be really interested to hear from students about kind of how they found the process so far, and if there's any particular aspects that they're interested to discuss.
Yeah, brilliant. We've got a question come through from Harrison. And I just thought I'd just kind of ask one to kind of add on. Thank you so much. Those tips were so good and really, really clear as well. So really fantastic, even thinking about how you pick your data, whether you want to use it for a statistic test, because I have so many students who do a questionnaire and they're like, oh, actually, I want to do a chi-square test or this, and then actually have to then recreate a whole new questionnaire. And then you've kind of lost those kind of first 30 people who you managed to ask the questions to. So I think really trying to plan that out kind of every stage of then, how you can present it. So it's also balanced, because you don't have everything for your first kind of question or hypothesis, and then not as much for everything else.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. it feels at the time that it's really self-indulgent to use that planning time to almost be thinking about your analysis and conclusion before you've even set out into the field. But from experience, my gosh, that time is banked time, and you get it back in spades afterwards because you already know exactly what you're doing in every stage after that point.
We get our students, I say it like called a balanced plan, where they write their kind of questions, their hypothesis, then there's kind of data collection, then their presentation. So as you said, it's all kind of pre-planned for them. If there are any more questions, do you want to, if everybody can write them in the comments, and then we will get them to Chloe as well. I had a question, and then I'll kind of pass over to Harris's one because it links to, we're going to talk about some of the amazing resources. In terms of what do you think of questions versus hypothesis? Like, obviously we want something we can test. What is your personal opinion? I have my personal opinion, but I wondered what you thought about whether students should be going along more the hypothesis, a testable statement, or whether you think it's okay to be open with like inquiry questions.
Right. So let's kind of first of all make this distinction between your title question and your research questions. Your title can be a little bit more broad than your research questions, but your research questions have to be super answerable. They have to be, you have to be able to, at each stage, relate back to them, and everything that you do needs to be able to answer that research question. My personal preference is to have 3 research questions, one of which relates, at least one of which relates to some which you can draw a hypothesis for, so a null hypothesis and an alternative hypothesis as well. If you're not sure on what the distinction is there, I can direct you towards some resources on that. That means that you have the ability to then do your stats test in relation to those hypotheses. You don't need to do a stats test for every research question. You have to demonstrate that you have the ability to use quantitative data in a different form of analysis, which is a statistical test. But a well-worded research question actually leaves you far more open for discussion. If you think about what a hypothesis actually is, it is very much answerable. Is this true or not true? And then sometimes when you get to the conclusion, if you've got too much of that holding your conclusion together, well, what more can you really talk about? Yeah, it was true. Great. Whereas if you've got a research question with a bit more to it, you can actually then build your conclusion together. And sorry, just on that point, with your research questions, of course, they're going to be related to each other. So the idea is that in your conclusion, you are actually talking about them as one coherent bubble of research. So you'll be dipping between the research questions so that they all feed each other into this big, nice geographical pickle picture.
Brilliant. That's a fantastic answer. Thank you. Yeah, again, like linking to kind of your planning of maybe where you want to use your stats test, what you're trying to prove, kind of that broader plan, as you said. And just in terms of one thing that students also struggle with previously I've had is that, again, as you said, that temporal change, and it's really hard to measure. And I don't know whether you think this, but one thing we've said is that if students actually have, because things do change in London, for example, where I am, and people sometimes, students sometimes like to see those human changes, but we found that having a particular date that you can then use as this is the before and this is the after makes it again much more manageable. Yes. And then Google Earth is just the best, you know, the street view where you can go back in time. Yeah, I think that's just the best thing, because you're not trying to find someone's taken a photo. There's actually so many photos around the streets in the UK, and that you can actually go back and jump back however many years, has actually made a really good data data method.
Absolutely. Yeah. Rephotography is what it's called. So if you find an old photograph of somewhere that you recognize from your field site, try and position yourself on the ground where that person took the photograph, and then retake that photograph. As you say, Google Maps, when you drag the little yellow man and you can have a look around places, you've got that slider, and you can therefore see what the place looked like. Sometimes actually, what are we in, 2022? I think about 2008, 2009, you can still, which is actually a decent time frame. So yes, pick a date which is manageable that you know that you can get the data for. With that in mind, also, if you're looking at something slightly more historical, Digimaps is also a great resource, because again, you can get a slider which can show you what an OS map or equivalent looked like at that point in time. But with that said, it can be very, very difficult to really produce meaningful geography if you're talking about something which was happening in the 1850s. Yeah, you're kind of clutching a little bit at straws with that. So I would pick a much narrower time frame, as you said, Ellie.
And I really like the whole kind of links that you were talking about. It's really actually exploring the geography. That's what the NEA is. And I really liked when you talked about not discounting anomalies, but actually trying to find out reasons of why they're there. I thought that was a really, really good tip. Harrison has said, do you have any tips for choosing a topic to study? Now, I do know you do have some resources on your website, but how would you go about, Harrison, maybe you could give us some more information, but how would you say, what are your kind of top tips for actually deciding the NEA?
Right, yeah. It's lots of things, it's lots of single things coming together to make the perfect topic. My number one thing, Harrison, would be to say, choose something that you genuinely find interesting. The NEA is not it's not an essay, it's not a short piece of coursework or anything like that. You're going to have to make sure that this topic has got the legs to sustain your interest over quite a long period of time. And the NEA is not a box ticking exercise for your A level. It's got to be something which potentially, I don't know what Harrison might be thinking of going on to study at university, but it might be something you want to talk about on your UCAS statement. It might be something you're going to be talking about at interview in future. So it's got to be something which is really grabbing you and exciting. It depends on your school setup. I know that some schools will take their students en masse to a particular location, and they'll say, here's where you've got to choose your field site from within this area. So that might be a factor, that you might have a really interesting idea, but it just won't work in that location. So make sure that that is part of your thinking as well. And then finally, kind of, you need to think, what does data look like in relation to this topic that I'm interested in? And is it collectible? You might be really interested in big, wide-ranging population studies or migration or something like that, but can you meaningfully collect data on that thing except dipping into the census? You know, can you actually get some primary data which is meaningful? So choose something which you love, make sure it works with your location that you're planning on going to, and make sure and actually look at what data is collectible on that topic. Then you start getting into the nitty-gritty of finding a title within that. Now, if you're a really confident geographer and you're interested in lots of different things and you can see the connections between lots of different topic areas, some teachers are going to hate me for saying this, but keep your title a little bit like a working title as late as you can. Right up, and so in some cases, some schools have been able to pretty much keep a working title right up until the minute they actually start writing it up, because it shows a great deal of maturity in research. You know, when you go off to university, when you do postgraduate studies as well, I can certainly speak for myself here. I did a ton of research, and at the end I looked at it and gone, what have I actually studied here? And then the last thing I wrote in my MSc thesis was the title. I didn't really know what I was studying in direct detail until that very last point. So I kind of had done all the research first, explored it in full, and then thought, what have I actually done? Now, it does take a very confident geographer to do that, but you can certainly have a kind of working title or 2 or 3 working titles which are kind of related. And then once you've actually done your data collection phase, you go, actually, that's the thing I'm studying. And it kind of focuses your mind slightly differently. So maybe think about that as well. And do talk to your teachers about that particular aspect of deciding on a title.
Thank you. So let's go on to the amazing resources that you have on your website, which are so student friendly and so beautifully, as I say, so beautifully curated. They're just, the color scheme is great, but their actual content is more important. So do you mind telling us, our kind of viewers, I'll put the link in the chat, but what kind of resources do you have? Because you always have resources for teachers there, but particularly for students, how can they get help from your website?
Yeah, so this all stemmed from students asking me an awful lot about statistical tests. So the first thing I've got on there is a guide to a working example within the guide to every type of statistical test that I believe you would need at A-level. That's not to say it is every stats test. It is not, but there's oh God, I'm thinking now, there's probably about 12, I think, on there, and they are, I hope, kind of super accessible. You can see how I have used data, which I've made it up. I've made the data up, but it is totally the kind of data that you could have happening in your NEA. Sitting alongside those, there's some stats calculators. You are studying geography. You are not studying maths. Well, you might be, but not within this subject. So you don't have to worry if you're not maths confident. You just need to know what the result of your stats test actually means within a geography context. So I've got some basic plug and play type things where you can plug your numbers into some Excel spreadsheets and it will give you a result at the end, and it will tell you what that result actually means in terms of significance and so on. There is a body of data collection sheets, blank templates, which is growing all the time. There's obviously so many different ways you can collect data that's something I'm kind of constantly updating. So thank you for reminding me, Ellie. I need to write some more. But there's quite a few on there, and they can help you to start thinking about the kind of things you could do with data collection. So I've tried to write those sheets in quite a generic way that covers lots of bases. Now, that doesn't mean you just download it and you have to do it in that manner, but it gives you hopefully some ideas about how you could structure some data collection around that. What else is on there? I'm trying to think. There's guides on how to choose stats tests. So if you're coming out of it thinking, I've got this type of data, but I don't really know which stats test is most appropriate. And remember, appropriate is a keyword in that mark scheme. You need everything to be appropriate for your study. So there's those things there. There's also some kind of bits and pieces about how you can, there's a blank research diary. So there's a template there that you might want to download, and it kind of shows the kinds of things you might want to record as your desk research. There's lots of stuff there on different types of data. So even if it's just knowing the difference between ordinal data and binary data and that type of thing, so you've got that kind of vocabulary in your grasp, there's some resources there too. But yeah, just Google the Island Geographer, and it's the first thing that comes up, hopefully, on your Google, and go to the resources section, and there's lots of stuff there, and I'm trying to add things all the time. So keep your eyes on it, basically.
Yeah, I just put loads of links, as I said. I was kind of going through them as you were talking about them, and there's just so many resources. There was kind of getting the most out of your questionnaire, as you know, I know you talked about before. There's just so many really good ideas. We do have one question, which is just on another question, just on time, because then we're going to kind of finish with how you got to where you are, Chloe. So, we've got from a student saying, I'm doing my NEA on comparing two woodland carbon content in my local area, one managed and one natural.
Ooh, nice.
Which specification would this link stronger to, ecosystems or carbon cycle? So
it depends what you're going to do with it, to be honest. It depends on the direction you want to take, because you could look at your two woodland and you're going to measure your carbon content and then say, well, why is one different from another? Maybe one's more deciduous and one's more coniferous, I don't know. And therefore you're going to be thinking about the literal structure of the trees, how they might be able to grow closer or further apart from each other, how woodlands are literally structured or managed. And that would be, I would sit that more with ecology, because it might even dip into conservation and how it's been managed in a particular way. If you are purely looking at more of it from a carbon sequestration kind of point of view, very much it's more in the carbon and water cycle sections. But I would honestly say I think you probably can have more to discuss in the ecology section. I think if you kind of go more in that direction, you can certainly reference stuff for carbon cycle notes. But I think just thinking about the kind of discussion work that you would need to have around the difference between managed and unmanaged, I'd say that sits more firmly with ecology.
And I think it's as you kind of said earlier about the kind of working title, like have both of your specs in at the moment and then maybe see where you're kind of going with it. And it looks like, there's loads of potential for really kind of good data analysis in those two different areas.
Now, I know in your, just coming back to that, I know in your proposal form for most of the awarding bodies, you have to say which bit of the spec it relates to. It's not the be all and end all.
You just it's more of a tick box, isn't it?
I just want to see that it relates to something. Yeah, you're not marked on that. And a really strong geographer will actually, within their discussion, be referencing that and other sections of the spec as well.
They have said really it'll be linking to climate change, which I think is quite a hard thing to measure. So I don't know what your views are on that. Well, it's quite hard for us, obviously, we've only got like sentences of what you're doing. So, I mean, this is just kind of massively interpreting, but we'll give Chloe a go quickly.
That's it. That's stuff I was talking about in terms of your title being quite broad. I'd say climate change is coming into that category. I think it would be such a massive thing. There is no way that you could say that one woodland is how can I put it, sequestering more carbon and therefore better for the environment under climate change than the other one. I think that's way too difficult to kind of discussion to have. I would go towards
keep
ecology.
It narrow. That's the first tip. So I'm just quickly going to show you on the slides, just with all those top tips if you've just joined us. But here were kind of Chloe's top tips or common mistakes. And then if you have missed it, then kind of earlier we spoke through all of those. So really quickly, we've got a couple of minutes left. How did you get to where you were? And do you have any tips for students picking their kind of going on to university and kind of making their next steps? And then we'll finish there.
Right. How did I get to where I am? Basically, it was a catalogue of errors and mistakes. I started in the classroom. I was there for about 20 years, both in the UK and overseas. And while I was overseas, I was incredibly lucky to work in lots of different African countries where I was given the opportunity to learn outside the classroom, to teach outside the classroom, because that was quite often the norm rather than the exception. And I developed my love for fieldwork through that. Talking very broadly, I made use of every opportunity that came my way. So I said yes to a lot of things. Sometimes in hindsight, people would say that wasn't a very sensible thing to do, but it gave me every experience to get to where I am now, and I love my work.
Brilliant.
So I'm very lucky.
Well, a huge thank you. You've been so informative and so good. I know students will be coming back to this in the kind of future when they're starting their NEAs, and I will definitely, hopefully, I've seen some of my students on here now, but I will definitely be highlighting to others in future years as well. So thank you so much, and also thank you for all the resources that you're creating as well. They're just so student friendly, and a massive thank you kind of for joining us and from the geography community as well.
Thank you for having me, and best of luck to everyone in their NEA. Keep going. It's worth it.
Students get so proud. I had a university student from her second year come back and said her NEA, who does geography, the NEA is still the biggest thing that she's done and the thing that she's most proud of, and probably will be until she does her dissertation.
Yeah.
So, brilliant.
Yeah, it's a big deal, but it's fun.
And just let everybody know for next week, we are, in a couple of weeks' time after half term, we will be speaking about a world without refugees. So if you are able to join me next week, again, I seem to have got the wrong end slide. So that is not what is coming up. That has been passed. If you want to listen to about Clean Air Day, check that out. That's already on my channel. But we'll be talking about a world without refugees. So hope you guys all have a lovely rest of your day and a lovely half term as well from me.